All right, good morning. I want to thank all of you for being with us today for our Kratom briefing. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Representative Dave Bratt and Representative Mark Pocan, as well as our co-sponsors of today's briefing, the American Kratom Association, the Botanical Education Alliance, People, Plant, and Health, Leaf of Faith, the Kratom Trade Association, and the Drug Policy Alliance. My name is Grant Smith. I'm the Deputy Director of National Affairs with the Drug Policy Alliance, a co-sponsor of today's briefing, and it's my pleasure to moderate our discussion today. In 2016, the Drug Enforcement Administration announced it would emergency schedule the herbal supplement Kratom as a controlled substance, banning it after a 30-day comment period. There was a tremendous outcry from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, as well as from the public, in response to the Drug Enforcement Administration's intent to ban Kratom. The DEA received more than 22,000 comments from the public overwhelmingly opposed to the ban, and bipartisan letters from Congress pleaded the DEA not to rush a decision. In an unprecedented action by the DEA, the agency backed down from the emergency schedule action, but the DEA's attempts to ban Kratom did not end there. The DEA requested from the Food and Drug Administration an 8-factor analysis and recommendation for scheduling Kratom as a controlled substance. Prior to these actions, the FDA had for years targeted Kratom with import alerts and seizures. However, the rationale for these seizures and the FDA's and Drug Enforcement Administration's actions against Kratom have been based on flawed data and science. These actions have continued along with increasingly dire warnings from the FDA against using Kratom. Presently, an estimated 5 million Americans use Kratom. A decision to ban Kratom and shut down the legal marketplace for this herbal supplement would criminalize millions who have used Kratom to improve personal health and wellness. So, what is Kratom? How is it used, and why is it used, and who uses it? Why has the Drug Enforcement Administration and the Food and Drug Administration targeted Kratom, and what evidence has the agencies presented to justify banning it? And why does the scientific community take issue with the FDA's conclusions about Kratom? Finally, what are members of the Kratom industry doing to address the FDA's concerns and improve regulation? These questions and more will be answered by our 5 panelists here today. And with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists. To my right, on the end, Dr. Andrew Krugel serves as Associate Research Scientist at Columbia University. Dr. Jack Henningfield serves as Vice President of Research, Health Policy, and Abuse Liability with Penny Associates in Bethesda. Dr. Henningfield also serves as Professor of Behavioral Biology, Adjunct with the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Murray Holcomb, a general surgeon, currently practices acute care and trauma surgery in Central Texas after 25 years of private practice in Kansas. Dr. Margaret Chisholm was on the invitation to attend today's briefing. Unfortunately, there was a scheduling conflict that came up. However, she has written a very poignant written statement that's available on the table outside. If you have a copy, I encourage you to read it. It's very poignant and very moving statement. Dr. Chisholm serves with the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And last but not least, Mr. Michael Werner is a partner in Holland Knight's Washington, D.C. office and co-chair of the firm's National Healthcare and Life Sciences Industry team. You can find more biographical information about our panelists today in the handout provided. Before we begin, I want to mention that each panelist is expressing their own independent views and not that of co-sponsors or sponsors of today's briefing. And with that, Dr. Krugel, please begin.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. My name is Andrew Krugel. I am a medicinal chemist at Columbia University in New York City, where I study the chemistry and pharmacology of psychoactive drugs. My colleagues and I have been studying Kratom in particular for the past 7 years or so. And we've done a lot of work to understand how this interesting plant works. So with that, I'd like to tell you a bit about the science behind this fascinating plant. So before I jump into Kratom itself, I thought it was important to give a little introduction to the opioid receptors and why this signaling system in your brain is so important for human health and why this area of research is so critical. So in your brain, there are compounds called endogenous opioids, things like endorphins, which you may have heard of in the context of runner's high, for example. And these substances activate opioid receptors, turn on opioid receptors. And through these proteins, the opioid receptors, they regulate a number of different important human behaviors, like your general mood state, natural reward responses. For example, after you eat, these compounds are released, stress resilience, social interactions, and of course, pain responses. And you well know that opioids have long been used as pain relievers. So it's not hard to imagine that dysfunction of these signaling systems could lead to a spectrum of disorders, not just physical pain, but also across what we call psychological pain, so things like depression and anxiety. And overall, these disorders I've listed here are joined by the commonality of having poor available drugs to treat them, huge patient populations, and often high comorbidity. So there's really a huge unmet need in medicine to develop new treatments for these disorders, and we believe that compounds modulating opioid signaling may actually fill that role, at least in part. Of course, the major problem is that all drugs that we have which modulate opioid signaling have serious side effects like addiction, respiratory depression, which is what kills people, constipation, etc. Fortunately, in the opioid field, we believe that compounds known as atypical opioids, so compounds which modulate these same systems in your brain but do so in a different and unique manner compared to classical drugs like morphine, may provide a solution to alleviate some of those side effects while still providing therapeutic benefit. So where do we find compounds like this? Well, one potential source is kratom. So this is a plant known by the scientific name Mitragina speciosa. It's native to Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, where it's been used for at least 100 years as a mild stimulant to aid agricultural workers in their daily labors on the farms, and also as an analgesic. And it's also seen some use as an aid for opioid withdrawal symptoms for people who are addicted to those drugs. It's typically consumed orally, either as a tea or the leaves are chewed directly. And importantly, the literature on use in those regions indicates that people who use kratom are not typically impaired in terms of their social functioning or ability to work, and they're well integrated into society. There's not a stigma to kratom use in the native regions. So of course, this interesting history of kratom has really spurred scientists to question how does this drug work and what can it do in terms of a more rigorously evaluated therapeutic option. And this research has really been spurred in the last 10 years by the growing use of kratom as an alternative medicine in the United States. So here you can see the Google search trends for kratom in the US, and there's been a tremendous increase in people interested in this compound in the United States, and there's a huge number of anecdotal reports now of people using this to treat pain, mental health disorders, and of course opioid addiction. So what do we know about kratom? Well, there's still a lot to be learned, but at present we know that mitragynine, this compound shown here in the middle, is the predominant active compound in kratom. So this is the molecule that gives kratom its effects on the brain. This compound activates opioid receptors, the same targets as drugs like morphine that you well know. However, it does so in a very different manner compared to those classical drugs. So one, it's called a biased agonist. So it turns on the mu-opioid receptor and activates one signaling pathway, what's called the G protein pathway, while avoiding turning on another pathway, the arrestin pathway. And perhaps the best analogy for this is a light switch that can control two lights, a red lamp and a green lamp. And kratom or mitragynine is able to turn on only the green lamp, but not turn on the red lamp, which leads to side effects. And then it's also at the same time what we call a partial agonist. So this only turns on the receptor about halfway. And again, you can use an analogy to a lamp on a dimmer switch. So where a full agonist like morphine might turn the lights on all the way, a compound like mitragynine is only turning on a dim light. And that's also known to be protective in terms of side effects of opioid drugs. So when you combine these two mechanisms at the molecular level, we expect a compound like mitragynine, the major active in kratom, to induce less side effects while still retaining the therapeutic benefits of the drug. And in fact, in animal models, we see that there's less respiratory depression, less abuse potential, and less constipation, which are all classical side effects of opioids like morphine. So how does this all relate to human research? Unfortunately, there's been no controlled clinical trials with Kratom or any of its active compounds. However, because of this huge user base, we've now learned a lot from anecdotal data, from user reports, about how this compound affects the brain and affects human behavior. So typically people are using somewhere between 1 and 10 grams of the dried powdered leaf material. So that little picture on the right side of the slide is what the dried leaf looks like as it's used by people in the United States. And they either eat this or drink it as a beverage. And people report getting profound analgesic effects, anti-anxiety and antidepressant effects. And in people who are using it to manage opioid addiction, we also see a profound reduction in opioid withdrawal symptoms and cravings for opioids. Of course, there are also some side effects. People report things like nausea, itching, sedation, and in people who use it for a long time, in some cases there's withdrawal symptoms, although typically those are significantly more mild than you would expect with other drugs in the class. So overall, the spectrum of effects is consistent with what we see in the preclinical science with a mild opioid-like effect. There's also been 2 surveys of over 10,000 US Kratom users suggesting profound therapeutic benefits, limited negative effects, and a socially and economically functional user base. So if you look at people who've responded to these surveys, they're largely middle income, middle class, mostly employed, and having at least some college education. So this is a demographic that's very different from your typical drug abuser population. So these are not the type of people you would see using heroin, for example. It's a very different group. And overall, these people report profound improvements in their symptoms, whether it's for pain, depression, or anxiety. And even in opioid use disorder, which is very severe disorder, you see at least 50% of people reporting either a decrease or a total cessation of their prescription or illicit opioid use. So it really has a profound opportunity here to ameliorate the opioid crisis, we believe, rather than worsen it. There were some negative outcomes reported in these studies. About 20% of people report side effects, although less than 1% of respondents actually sought medical treatment for those side effects. So generally, we believe them to be not very severe. And about 2% of patients did meet criteria for what we would call a Kratom use disorder, so some sort of abusive behavior of the drug. So there is some risk of abuse, but it's important to emphasize again, or offset that again against the profound therapeutic benefit that the drug seems to have, at least in this anecdotal data. And what about just general overdose safety? Can this kill you? Well, respiratory depression, which is the classical effect of opioids that usually leads to death, is not usually reported with Kratom use. The compounds in Kratom and the drug itself are low potency. It's used in a dilute formulation, the leaf, which only contains about 1% by weight of the active compounds. So there's really a practical dose ceiling for how much you can eat of this stuff. And also, because it's in a ground leaf form, which is insoluble, does not dissolve in water, you can't use it by an intravenous route, you can't snort the drug, so it's really not used in any typical way that you would see most drugs of abuse being used. And there have been 44 deaths reported by the FDA in all of history worldwide associated with Kratom, but it's important to emphasize that nearly all of these involved other drugs in the system of the deceased or pre-existing medical conditions or other causes of death. And even if you were to grant that all these deaths were caused by Kratom worldwide in all of time, 44 is a minuscule number in comparison to the 30,000 deaths in 2017 alone from fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, which are one of the primary drivers of the opioid crisis. So we believe there's a very strong risk-benefit ratio for Kratom use, even as it is now. And to summarize here, Kratom does appear to have a profound therapeutic effect or potential in humans, but there's a lot of important research still to be done. We'd like to know more about how addictive Kratom is in rigorous human studies. We'd like to examine more about other potential negative effects associated with its use, for example, toxicological side effects. We need to know more about the epidemiology of its use. How many people are using this? What are they using it for? And most importantly, we need to know whether it's efficacious in medical disorders in controlled clinical trials, as you would do with the FDA. Unfortunately, if Kratom were to be put in Schedule 1, as has been proposed several times over the past couple years, this research would likely be delayed by many years, if not decades. And we've seen this again and again with promising therapeutic compounds that are placed prematurely in Schedule 1. It becomes almost impossible to do the serious research that you need to get the answers that everybody wants, both the scientists in academia and the scientists at the FDA. So I hope Kratom stays legal, at least till we can learn more about it. And that concludes my presentation. Happy to take questions later on.
Good morning, and thank you for being here and holding this hearing. It's really important to get the word out and get your help and get your understanding and ideas in this process. I'm Jack Henningfield, and through Pinney Associates, I consult on new drug development. Most of my work involves a wide range of drugs, sedatives, opioids. I've been involved in the science or approval of most addiction drug products approved since 1980, and I'm proud of that. I live and breathe that kind of work. I was trained in neuropharmacology and addiction science in the 1970s, and in 1980s and 90s I headed the National Institute on Drug Abuse, that's NIDA, their clinical pharmacology program and abuse potential assessment laboratory. And our job is to advise FDA and DEA on drug scheduling. And if you haven't discussed Kratom with people at the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I urge that you do so. They're the keepers of the science when it comes to addiction, and my sense is that FDA did not consult with NIDA as they should have on these issues. Let me start with a brief comment on behalf of a colleague at Johns Hopkins in my department, Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And copies of her statement to you are available and her testimony to an FDA hearing. It's Dr. and Professor Margaret Chisholm. Her clinical responsibilities at Johns Hopkins prevent her from being here today. She's a board-certified professor of psychiatry and addiction medicine specialist, and she's a nationally recognized leader in addiction medicine. So after a number of us, 8 other scientists, including Dr. Krugel, sent a letter to the White House in February, and that got widespread distribution, I got an email from her. And it was a little bit more personal than a lot of them. And on March 28th, I got this email that said, "Thank you for doing this, Jack. It is of utmost importance, and I hope it's impactful." My reply, "Thank you. FDA is wrong in the science, wrong in the policy, but what drives me is that there are real people who are using Kratom in place of opioids, whether their opioid use was for pain or addiction. They are rightfully scared to death of a Kratom ban. That would be like reversing needle exchange programs." She got back to me. "Jack, our 25-year-old son is one of those people. He uses minimal doses of Kratom to manage successfully his history of opioid dependence. We are all gravely concerned as to what this scheduling might mean for him and our family." With her son's permission, she testified at the April 17th NIDA FDA opioid use disorder hearing. And I suggest that you read her testimony. I testified, a number of other people testified and offered written testimony. We're here today because 2 years after DEA withdrew its effort to and proposal to schedule Kratom, FDA is pressuring DEA to do that. And at that time, FDA was urging DEA to do it. This time it's with the force of FDA's 8-factor analysis, and that carries much more weight. Back in 2016, DEA, in response to, I think, close to 52 members of the House and about 10, 11 members of the Senate and as you heard, thousands of comments from the public withdrew the proposal. I met with DEA people, and they were concerned. They understood it. They got it, that you don't pull the rug out of people that are using, especially using in place of opioids in an opioid epidemic. They passed it to FDA for advice. Me and others were aghast when FDA in November said Kratom is a narcotic-like opioid in terms of addiction and death. And it's not a narcotic-like opioid in terms of addiction and death. FDA didn't follow the science. They apparently didn't follow the surveys. Dr. Krugel showed you a survey from 10,000 people. There are 3 other surveys. We have surveys from close to over 20,000 people. More than 23,000 comments to FDA. Almost a century of study and observation in Southeast Asia that puts Kratom in a very different bucket. That's like putting caffeine in along with crack cocaine, because they're both stimulants, they both cause physical dependence, and caffeine does sometimes cause death. It's not innocuous, but to lump it with cocaine, that doesn't make sense. Dr. Chisholm's son, I met with him, he asked me the same question many people do. Why is FDA doing this? There are a lot of conspiracy theories. I don't buy the conspiracy theories. I think my motto is, when you suspect conspiracy, assume incompetence. And I think FDA commissioner was not served well. I think if they had consulted their Office of Dietary Supplements, they would have gotten a different story about NIDA, because that office is looking at Kratom. FDA was right to ask if Kratom might be part of the opioid epidemic. That's what they should do. But they should have asked, is it a path to the epidemic or a path away? If they followed the data, they would have found that there is no evidence that Kratom is a path to opioids, or that Kratom is causing any or substantial numbers of deaths. But they would have found that Kratom is a path away from opioids, and probably for thousands of people in every state in our nation. Fortunately, the Controlled Substances Act means that DEA is the final arbiter of scheduling. Now, what's scary is that DEA almost always follows FDA's lead, and DEA is under pressure to follow FDA's lead. And I think that DEA will need the support and cover, quite frankly, of congressional members to stand up to FDA. I believe that if you talk to NIDA, I think you would get a different picture of the science than FDA is presenting. So what do we need? We need a legal market that's regulated. We have a legal market right now, but it's not regulated. FDA needs to step up to the plate and do its job. Set standards for how much 7-hydroxy, how much mitragynine should be in products. Everything it does for other dietary supplements. It's the best agency in the world at that. We need it doing its job. If it kicks the ball to the black market, because that's what will happen if Kratom is banned, the problems that do exist will be magnified. Then we replace vendors competing on the basis largely of price and quality with the black market, and that is a vulturous market. Let me comment also on whether or not Kratom could or should be scheduled. That's what I do on a daily basis. I work with companies, and when I was at NIDA, that was my job, on how drugs should be scheduled, how new products should be scheduled, whether they should be scheduled. Oftentimes the question isn't, could it be scheduled? It's, should it be scheduled? You know, should caffeine be scheduled? It meets all criteria pharmacologically, but that doesn't make any sense. What about nicotine gum? Well, FDA concluded that nicotine gum met criteria for scheduling. Surgeon General Koop, one of my heroes and mentors since 1980 until he died, he testified and said that didn't make any sense. He said it's easy to get what kills you, it's hard to get the treatment, we need to reverse that. I think the same thing applies here. Dextromethorphan, a lot of other things, cough medicines, a lot of things could be scheduled, but it doesn't make sense. What does make sense is regulation, regulation that's balanced. and allows consumers to know what they're buying and be reassured that if a product is adulterated, it will be withdrawn, and standards for it. I testified at the NIDA FDA opioid use disorder hearing, and at that hearing it was powerful because most of the people there had opioid use disorder. Some of them said, look, methadone and buprenorphine worked for me. Others said it worked, but I couldn't get into the clinic, or I lost access to the clinic. Others said it worked at one stage and then I turned to Kratom. Others said, why are you just focusing on drugs? We don't want drugs, we want natural products. Well, I testified that in the context of the opioid epidemic and helping people, Kratom is an in-hand asset. It's not a path to opioids, it's a path away. I said banning Kratom would be like taking life preservers away from people that are struggling in the ocean because they're not Coast Guard approved. And that's part of what FDA has said. And FDA has said, get into FDA approved drug treatment. Well, a lot of people can't, and for a lot of people there's stigma. And for a lot of people, the drugs are not acceptable or effective. Kratom's working for them. Pulling it away makes no sense. That would be a disaster. So we need your help. The FDA is doing, I think, a great job of incentivizing the pharmaceutical industry to develop alternatives to opioids, to develop more treatments for addiction. We need all of that. But the road to drugs is generally 10 years and $2.7 billion. For people that say, well, take Kratom off the market and properly develop it as a drug, well, then we lose the asset and wait for 10 years and $2.7 billion. And that's not going to happen. That's why you have a Dietary Substances Act, so people can get help from things that may help, but will never go through that $2.7 billion 10-year process. So thank you for being here. Let me know what we can do to help.
Please excuse any hesitation or confusion or anything. I don't normally speak in public, but it's an honor and a privilege to be here. I thank you for that. It's an even greater honor and privilege to represent some of these people who really can't speak for themselves. I came to this approximately 2 years ago when we first heard of the motion to schedule Kratom. I have been as involved as I can. I'm a practicing acute care and trauma surgeon. I've done that for 30 years. I see this every day in my practice and some of the problems that go along with mental health and addiction. Unfortunately, my wife and I and my family have experienced this on a personal basis. It's cut a wide swath through our family for generations of mental health and addiction. I'm blessed in that I'm here today and that my son is alive and well. Too often, advocacy is a posthumous pursuit, and my heart goes out to these people. You know, I learned 3 days ago of a young man who passed away in the town I lived in for 25 years after a battle with addiction. I knew his parents for 25 years. My heart goes out to them. Their light went out, but that same light goes out 150 times at least a day in this country, and it's tragic. You know, that's more people last year than we lost in the Vietnam War. That's 29 11s. You know, what resources have we committed to that, and what do we really commit to this? It's minuscule, really, in comparison to our military and research and treatment for other maladies such as heart disease and cancer. You know, mental health and addiction are pervasive problems in this country. It's estimated that 1 in 5 people will experience a mental health issue every year. 1 in 25 will experience a severe episode which interferes or disrupts their lives in a significant way. Approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of those people will also have a substance abuse disorder. That's called dual diagnosis. I think that's probably where my son falls into this. Unfortunately, this community, they're often marginalized, openly denigrated, embarrassed, criticized, mocked. It's tragic. I think it's important that we understand that this isn't a moral failing or a character flaw. These are real diseases. These people are all around us. They're our family, our spouses, our coworkers, our friends. I think they deserve our love, respect, and commitment to their well-being. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. My oldest son experienced this. Our lives changed 10 years ago this month with a 2 a.m. phone call. He was despondent, inconsolable, really unable to relate what the problem was, and we were 200 miles away. We drove there immediately, took him to the Student Health Center at the University of Kansas, which is my alma mater. First interaction with the healthcare system in that venue was one of being embarrassed and humiliated. He sat in a room full of people, and a person working called across the room, called his name, and said, "Grant Holcomb, are you in crisis?" You just imagine how he felt. And the outcome that day was a prescription for Zoloft, an admonition to quit drinking, and to come back in 4 weeks. What are we going to do during that 4 weeks? You know, one of the things that goes along with mental health and addiction are fear and shame. Fear and shame. And those two things many times prevent people from seeking the care that they need and they deserve. I look at the Kratom issue from 4 areas: medical, regulatory, sociologic, and personal. The medical synopsis you heard today are excellent. I can't really add anything to that. I'm not an attorney. I don't necessarily understand regulatory issues, but I can tell you this. I think if Kratom doesn't fit into the current framework that we have, then we need a transitional framework, because taking it away will be cruel and counterproductive and may accelerate the problem that we're already seeing, unless we want to solve the problem by attrition, and that's not even happening. So on a personal basis, I want to say that started a 7 to 10 year journey today, this month, that we went through. It was all-consuming. It led to the darkest of places, oftentimes with no hope on the horizon. My wife and I stayed at his side much of the time, even though we lived and worked 200 miles away. He tried almost every medication and combination thereof. We went to the Mayo Clinic. We went to the Massachusetts General Hospital. We tried transcranial magnetic therapy for $12,000 out of pocket. Sorry. Eventually, he underwent ECT when seemingly there were no other options available. The results were devastating. 6 months of confusion, headaches, amnesia. If you can imagine trying to contain a 23-year-old man and manage them. And that's a problem I see in my practice. People with mental health and addiction, their parents have no control and are desperate. You can see the looks in their eyes. Eventually, amazingly, he completed his college degree. Amazingly. It was like Mount Everest. He moved to Austin, Texas, where we had relocated, and got a job working for Apple Computer. He did really very well at that. He had good reviews, and they offered him a full-time job because he initially worked as a contractor. During that time, however, he was seeing a doctor, and he had a prescription for Xanax, and that use accelerated. And then a friend of his, coworker, died of a heroin overdose. Later, we found out that this young man had an opioid addiction problem a few years before, which he developed after a training accident in the military. It was devastating. The next thing that happened was he was arrested for shoplifting, 8 in the evening. He scanned $100 worth of items at Walmart, and apparently 2 items he didn't scan. So, as part of his promotion, becoming a full-time Apple employee, they redid his background check, and he failed that. He lost the job as a contractor. So you can see how things spiral out of control. Legal issues, addiction issues, mental health issues, they all combine. And at that point, everything accelerated to the point where he wrecked his car Fortunately, he wasn't hurt. No one else was hurt. He relented and went to rehabilitation. He was in fairly intensive rehabilitation for almost a year. 7 months into this, he told my wife and I, he says, you know, and we could tell, we could see in his eyes, he was void, empty. The anxiety and depression were still there. He had a distinct inability to enjoy anything or derive any pleasure from anything. And it was devastating. He's a smart young man. He had done his research. He had read. And I'll tell you, unbeknownst to us, he started taking Kratom. I found out later, and I was upset, honestly. I'd heard of it before. I'm kind of an anti-substance person, even though I'm a physician. I'm a kind of anti-medicine person. I like naturopathic type remedies that don't have side effects. But you can't argue with the results. Within 3 to 4 days, the results were immediately apparent to everybody. Everybody. Since that time, he's a normal young man. He's the son we always thought he would be. The compulsion to drink, consume drugs, it's gone. He's held a job for the past 2.5 years. He's responsible. He's reestablished relationships with his brother and sister. He's a proud uncle. He maintains healthy relationships. He works hard on his life, spirituality, giving back to others. And Kratom is the only variable there. He's experienced no discernible side effects. He'll be the first one to tell you, though, it's not just Kratom. Kratom's one piece of the puzzle, but it gave him the capacity to do the other things in his life to make his life better. The thought of that being pulled away from him is frightening. Just all of a sudden, someone who's responsible, going to work, becoming a felon, and being forced to choose between illicit substances or black market Kratom or going back to alcohol and benzodiazepine, which were prescribed. It's a devastating issue. At that point, I became involved in some of the advocacy. I wrote hundreds of letters, wrote hundreds of emails, reviewed as much as I could, tried to understand the science. And what I can tell you is that looking at this from a societal point of view, relative risk and greater good is important. Tylenol, 100,000 calls to poison control centers every year, 80-some thousand hospital ER visits, 30-some thousand hospitalizations, and the most common cause of acute liver failure. Benzodiazepines, at least 10,000 deaths per year. Premature deaths in British studies. Severe cognitive dysfunction, premature dementia. Alcohol, 6 to 8 deaths every day from acute alcohol poisoning. 80 to 85,000 deaths associated with alcohol every year. And I always say, when we would take him out to dinner when he was in treatment, the first thing they put in front of him in a restaurant was an alcohol menu. We just dangle these things in front of people. The most dangerous substance we have in this country, next to tobacco, which kills over 400,000 people a year, and it's there for the taking. Just like the prescription for the benzodiazepines is there for the taking. If you look at the people in this country who need treatment for mental health and addiction issues, or specifically addiction issues, in 2009, there were 20,000 people, 12 and over, who needed treatment. Only a little over 10% of those people were able to receive that treatment. 90% can't get there. Many mental health providers and addiction centers operate on a cash-only basis. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. For anybody that did not have the resources and time that my wife and I had, I feel terrible for it. It must take hopelessness to a new level that we can never understand. When they say that, well, we have good medical assisted treatments, I think that's a falsehood. Number one is it's not available. The costs are out of reach for too many people. If you look at methadone, 3,000 deaths every year out of 300-some thousand people taking it. That would equate to 25 to 50,000 deaths a year in the Kratom community. Buprenorphine and Suboxone probably safer by a factor of 6 to 8, according to British studies, but it's also not satisfactory for everybody. Now, for people who are taking it and they're doing well, I applaud that and I hope they can continue. Nobody wants to take that away, but the same thing doesn't exist for everybody. In my son's case, and I appreciate the issue about the endogenous opioid system, it's integral to our physical and mental well-being. Unfortunately, there's preconceived notions anytime the word opioid or opioid receptor is used that raise all kinds of issues. And it's unfortunate, it's a disservice. But what a lot of people don't understand, that there are things in our diet that we consume every day. Coffee, spinach, gluten, milk, chocolate, all have opioid peptides, substances which interact with our opioid system. And blocking that completely, like one of the new treatments, can have serious side effects. I don't think that the FAERS database is interpreted by the FDA. I think their conclusions are invalid. But even as he said, even if 7 deaths per year were caused by Kratom in a cohort equal to or double the size of the active opioid population at this point in time, that would speak to its relative safety and effectiveness. That would cry out for expanding access, expanding research. Unfortunately, research is limited because the commercial industry probably won't embrace it. You can't patent a plant. And I would be one of the first people to tell you, and I'll wrap up shortly, that I believe that Kratom's safety and effectiveness probably resides in the whole plant form. If you isolate one of those compounds, you concentrate it, you synthetically modify it, it might be dangerous. But that's where the industry will go, because there's a narrative in this country that for every illness, there's an isolated synthetic modified compound called a drug that will treat your malady. I think that's probably not the case. So, unfortunately, there's the treatment's not out there, the availability is not out there, the access is not out there, the affordability is not out there. I talked to a young man named Louis Barrick in Chicago, and he said it was okay to use his name. He struggled with heroin addiction. He's been clean for 6 years. Kratom makes his life better. He's responsible. He goes to work. He takes care of his family. And he spends $100 a month on Kratom. Not $200 for an appointment to get a $500 medicine. It brings it within reach of many people. And I think it's important that we know that. I think taking it away will be counterproductive, cruel, and can accelerate this terrible problem. I'm sure there's something I missed in there somewhere, but I appreciate the time. And I have given a narrative summary that will be posted on the website. And if anybody wants to call me anytime, I'll answer the phone 24 hours a day. I'd love to talk to you. I'll travel anywhere, talk to anybody anytime. I think it's that important. I appreciate your time.
Good morning. Good morning. My name is Michael Werner. I am an attorney, as you heard, with expertise in FDA and DEA regulatory issues and law. It's a privilege to be here this morning, not only to talk about this issue, but to be up here with such distinguished colleagues, distinguished scientists, and of course Dr. Holcomb, whose story is so powerful. So what you've heard this morning is about the science of Kratom and why the science of it does not indicate that the product should be scheduled or taken away. You've heard personal stories about that as well. And I'm just going to close the loop and tell you that under the law, it shouldn't be scheduled, Kratom shouldn't be scheduled or prohibited from individuals either. So you've heard that Kratom is a natural product, that it's the leaf of a plant. You've heard that it's used to improve well-being by millions. You've heard about the profile of the people who tend to consume Kratom. You've also heard that for some of those people, they report that it has helped them either avoid the use of addictive drugs or prescription drugs, or it has helped them, wean themselves off of those drugs as well. So what is currently Kratom is currently regulated as a dietary supplement, and that's the appropriate form of regulation for a product like this. And what that means from a legal perspective is that manufacturers, retailers, vendors all have to comply with FDA's regulations around dietary supplements, which, by the way, are significant. They require, for example, good manufacturing practices. They require that labels of products be accurate, truthful, not misleading. Okay, so there's a whole series of regulatory requirements that manufacturers and retailers of dietary supplements have to abide by. And in fact, the very fact that FDA has been regulating Kratom as a dietary supplement is what ensures that products are safe, that consumers know, as Jack said, that consumers have information about the product so that they can use it responsibly. And you've all probably heard that over the past several months, there have been some incidences of contaminated product with salmonella. And it is because FDA regulates Kratom as a supplement that the agency was able to find out about this, was able to work with the relevant manufacturer, retailer, vendor to identify the batches of Kratom that were contaminated and remove those products from the market, again, to ensure consumer safety. And of course, you also know that we've also had lots of salmonella outbreaks in all kinds of food products lately, lettuce and a whole sorts of other things. So, salmonella is not something inherent in Kratom. It turns out that there's been some batches that were contaminated, but because FDA regulates it like a supplement, FDA was able to take the appropriate action. We're able to remove those batches or dispose of them so they're not in the marketplace so that consumers are protected. The other legal issue that we're talking about today is scheduling, right? The scheduling of drugs and other substances is authorized under the Controlled Substances Act, okay? And drugs and substances are classified under this schedule, right, based on that product's abuse potential, physical, psychological dependence liability, and accepted medical use in the U.S. And by the way, for those of you who don't know, we're here talking a lot about Schedule 1, and I'll talk about that more. But there's actually several categories, goes all the way through Schedule 5, and every drug that you take or have taken, and many, many of the substances that we eat every day, are scheduled by the DEA, okay? Schedule 1 is for products that are found, and I'm gonna read it very carefully, right, that have a high potential for abuse, right, and no currently accepted medical use, and a lack of accepted safety for use under medical treatment. That's what Schedule 1 means. And the law says that the federal agencies involved, HHS, which is really an FDA, and the DEA have to do a so-called 8-factor analysis to determine whether or not the product should be scheduled or where it should be scheduled. And if you haven't read it, I really, in the data room that we have that's on the webpage, you should read. Dr. Henningfield published, actually, an 8-factor analysis of Kratom. I don't want to go through all 8 right now, but I want to just highlight the 2 big ones. So the question is, does it have the potential for abuse? That's sort of the big factor, right? There's 8, that's a big one. There's also whether it has a history or pattern of abuse, and what, if any, risk there is to the public health. Okay, so that's 3. But I think the point here is what you've heard from the scientists, and you've heard a patient, a personal testimonial, that Kratom does not meet those standards. there's no evidence that there is this potential for abuse. And in fact, what Dr. Krugel was saying was that it's there's reports that in fact it's not, and that the substance itself, its physical composition, and we have part of those surveys also talk about people's experience with kratom. There's no evidence at all, and there'd almost be no way physically for people to abuse kratom. So, what the law says is that if FDA comes down and says, hey, we recommend a schedule, right? We recommend Schedule 1 for kratom. The DEA still has to determine whether that evaluation and that recommendation and so-called other relevant data, quote unquote, constitutes substantial evidence for scheduling and do its own 8-factor analysis. So even if the FDA, for whatever reason, has recommended scheduling, the DEA still is the backstop here and determines whether that was appropriate and whether they agree. And if they do, they schedule and they use an administrative process with notice and comment rulemaking and all the things that you're familiar with. But by no means are they required to agree with the FDA's approach. And as we've said here today, and you've heard, kratom does not meet the criteria at all for placement in Schedule 1 because there really is not a high potential of abuse, and there really is not a risk to the public health. And in fact, as you heard from Dr. Holcomb and Dr. Henningfield, you could argue there's a risk to public health by putting it in Schedule 1, because if a product is in Schedule 1, that means virtually all research is shut down, right? The products that are in Schedule 1 are like, heroin is Schedule 1, right? That means that research is shut down. That means that it is criminal violation for using it, getting it, selling it. So basically, the product either disappears or worse, gets driven underground. So if we want to talk about heroin, right, it's a Schedule 1 product. It's not like we don't know that there's a heroin epidemic in this country. Instead, it's all driven underground. So we would actually lose the opportunity to do the research that Dr. Krugel talked about, where we think that there might actually be some really good medical potential. We would lose the opportunity to get access to the product, like Dr. Holcomb was talking about, for his son. And we would do it really despite not meeting the criteria in the Controlled Substances Act. So what do we need from all of you? Well, you've already done a lot, which is to say there's no federal legislation that requires putting kratom in Schedule 1, right? So for example, the opioid legislation that passed, it just talked about drugs as defined by the FDA, as defined by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So despite there have been a few people who've put some bills out there, there's no effort to legislatively put kratom in Schedule 1. But we do need to make sure that the DEA knows that it would be the congressional perspective, as has been stated in previous years, that scheduling kratom would be a mistake. It would be a mistake scientifically, it would be a mistake legally, and more to the point, it would actually create a tremendous amount of human harm. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
All right, I want to thank our panel for their great presentations. Really appreciate it. Also want to remind all of you that we have lunch in the back, so please help yourself either now or on the way out as you go. We definitely don't want to have any leftovers, here. So I had planned to ask our panel a round of questions. However, we have about 15 minutes left before we have a hard stop. So I want to make sure we have time for your questions. So please. Do we have questions for our panel? Yes. Dr. Henningfield?
Kratom medications?
For medically, therapeutic potential. Elaborate.
Well, right now, actually, the research, such as Dr.
Oh,
Krugel.
yes, Dr. Henningfield, would you come up?
right now there is research that NIDA, my old institute, is supporting and others are supporting to develop analogs of mitragynine as potential medicines of the future to treat addiction, to treat pain, to treat other disorders. That's really exciting. That's a long path. That's a 10-year, $2.7 billion path on average. So that's happening. Some of those same investigators have said, if it's put in Schedule 1, our research is shut down. It's not impossible. My lab at NIDA and my group at Hopkins, we do Schedule 1, but it's really difficult. It's really expensive and it's very slow. So it's really exciting, but that's not going to help the opioid crisis right now. And look at this in the context of the opioid crisis. 2 recent studies, Annals of Internal Medicine, suicide rates are going up in people with chronic pain, in part because it's getting harder to get opioids for pain medicine. That's good. We're fighting for that. But don't then take away Kratom if that's helping them. The other study in Science last week, the opioid epidemic is shifting from prescription to fentanyl and street drugs. Why? Because we are making some progress on the prescription side. So Kratom is another asset in that. Put this in the big picture context.
Kind of similar in that vein, and you touched on it. What's really the difference between like medicated assisted treatment, which Congress has been very focused on, and getting access to that for the opioid crisis, and Kratom? I mean, is in the way that folks on MAT are able to wean themselves off of opioids and use that consistently for over a long period of time, and this sounds like Kratom is being used.
I think it fits in that group. I'm sorry, you want me to stand up?
Yes, please.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think it fits into that group. The main thing I see is that a number of people won't seek out help because of stigma issues, fear issues, things like this. This allows them some path to try to manage themselves, and that's not a bad thing if you're trying to do that. I would also say that it's where the other medications may have side effects that are undesirable, and they have a defined mortality rate. Kratom doesn't seem to have that, and it can be affordable to people who are not able to access the medical system. I also wanted to add in, I forgot to say earlier about my son and his Kratom usage. It doesn't make him high, loopy, forgetful, or anything but normal. Normal. You wouldn't know that he's taking it. And lastly, I want to say that I think all responsible Kratom advocates are in favor of regulation, common sense regulation, to avoid, adulteration, things like that, and ongoing research. I think the thing I also want to mention is I'm pretty sure that the federal government, through the NIH, funded Suboxone research to the tune of at least $100 million. I think we should do at least that, because we're probably not going to get Kratom research on the whole plant from industry. It's just not going to happen. They'll work on the isolated compounds, and I think that's appropriate as well.
Can I add to this briefly? I also just want to add that if we look at the basic chemistry and biology of a drug like buprenorphine, which is in Suboxone and used for medication-assisted treatment, it's actually very similar to mitragynine itself, which is the main active compound. So they're both partial agonists. They both have this biased signaling effect, which makes them less risky in terms of overdose risk and respiratory depression. It's just that mitragynine is much less potent. And then if you look at the plant, there's other compounds in there which are not well studied and have other effects on different systems in your brain that have not been researched thoroughly at all. And we believe that may actually interact to produce even safer combination therapy through a polypharmacological approach. But more research is needed on that front.
Yes.
Let me add a quick thing to that. In Southeast Asia and Malaysia, there are probably hundreds of millions of Kratom users. They drink it in place of coffee and tea, a lot of them to wake up. That's not why people use opioids, and to increase focus. And NIDA brought over the top researchers to a special panel last June to get them in the room. And they shared their experiences, and they said a lot of what you're hearing today. People, they have an opioid problem, people get off opioids, drinking Kratom tea, and they get their lives back. They go back to work. And they bluntly said, on Kratom, they can work, they can have family and social lives. And that's really different from opioids.
Yes.
Earlier this year, the House passed a bill, CITSA, that would have made analogs of opioids essentially Schedule I substances. I heard the doctor here on this side talk about development of analogs of nitrazine. Had the Senate gone along with CITSA and it had been signed into law, would that have cut off that angle completely? Given that my understanding at least is that anything that was generally considered an opioid analog would have been a Schedule I controlled substance.
Well, looking at this from the perspective of a chemist, CITSA actually requires that there is structural similarity between the compounds to be scheduled and something that's already scheduled. So because mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine and these compounds are very structurally distinct at the molecular level from existing opioids, they should not be covered by that. Of course, you can make all kinds of rationalizations and bastardizations of the law to make things fit, but rationally speaking, it should not be covered by CITSA, from my perspective.
And,
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the Kratom community broadly was very concerned about that language in the House passed bill because Dr. Krugel is not running a federal agency right now, right? And so given sort of the climate that we're in and some of the, let's call it misinformation that's out there, the community was concerned that somehow that language could be read to sweep in Kratom. So that's why we had some concerns about it, and as of course you know, it wasn't included in the final bill.
Right, and it's not subject to judicial review, that new scheduling process. So no matter what rationalization I have, it's not very useful if the DEA decided to do something.
Yeah, let me just add to a lot of the scientific organizations. Right now, that's a problem that doesn't need to be fixed. We've got emergency scheduling powers. It gives DEA the ability to move very quickly for 2 years, and I mean very quickly, and that is working. And the idea that you could just sweep it in without input, that would be like putting Department of Justice in charge of what's the flu virus vaccine going to look like. That doesn't make sense. If kratom was a molecule derived from opium, it's automatically scheduled. Since it's not, it has to be on the basis of pharmacology and risk. Is it an imminent public health threat? And the answer is, we don't see an imminent public health threat from kratom access. We see surveys show a foreseeable public health threat from banning kratom. And does it act like an addictive drug in animal and human tests? And one of the animals tests was done at my old institute, NIDA. And that and another study showed that compared to heroin and methamphetamine, kratom looks like placebo. Mitragynine looks like placebo. But guess what? They let the animals push levers and get heroin. Then they gave them mitragynine. As they gave them more mitragynine, they stopped taking heroin. Another study showed them stop taking morphine. That doesn't prove, it's not an approved drug for that. But the pharmacology supports what people are doing.
And just one more interesting contrast to add would be when the DEA goes ahead with emergency scheduling of butyryl fentanyl or some unknown synthetic analog, you don't see 20,000 public comments. They're unopposed in that, so their authority is perfectly sufficient, I think, for that purpose.
All right. Additional questions? Yes.
Would you support regulation that required a certain age to buy kratom or some other protective
I would.
measures, like tobacco or alcohol?
Sure.
I would.
Absolutely.
Really quickly, American Kratom Association put out a series of principles, and a lot of others support that. And one of them was, look, even though we don't see a youth problem, that makes sense. Set an age limit. Right now, as was mentioned, kratom is sold as a dietary, but FDA isn't really doing much. It hasn't set any standards for products. It hasn't told manufacturers what you can and can't put on the label. It's just coming down on top of them when they really cross the line. We need comprehensive standards that make sense, and age could easily be one of them.
Yeah, I would say, so I endorse all that, and I think there's actually a couple things FDA could do, right? I mean, there's that. They certainly could be either funding themselves or supporting research, and I think that they could be continue to regulate appropriately as a supplement, and all what Jack was just talking about, and whether that's kind of elaborating more on standards, whether that's ensuring, better information is available for consumers, all of those things, and kind of essentially working with the regulated industry and the scientific community sort of on the path forward, right? I think that would be a very constructive role for the agency, and I think that the community would welcome that, because I think I'd like to think that we're all sort of trying to achieve the same goal, and I think that's the best way forward.
One addition, a lot of the problems that FDA raises, they'll say, look, there's been adulterated products. There have been. If FDA regulates, then it has a quicker way of saying, what are the standards for a legal product and what are the standards for an adulterated product? It's clear, and if you violate it, you're not on the market, or FDA puts the word out. Same thing for labeling claims. All these things that FDA is worried about, that can be addressed if FDA does its job. If it kicks it to the black market, there is no arbiter. That's deadly scary.
We have time for one last question. Yes.
So, with the studies on kratom so far, have there been any specific drug interactions that have seemed particularly dangerous? Like someone who's on this prescription drug probably shouldn't be taking kratom. And if so, is there any process now for a dietary supplement to have that label or be available to the consumer?
Jack, you want to take that?
Kratom's really interesting. There are a lot of substances. Nutmeg, you take too much, you can have hallucinations and vomit. 2 cigarettes contain enough nicotine to probably kill a child. You don't see many deaths because they vomit it up. And with kratom, it's interesting. Some of the comments on the FDA DEA website is it's self-limiting. You take too much, you feel pretty sick to your stomach. So it's probably not surprising that in all of Southeast Asia, when the team came over to testify in the night of hearing or present the night of hearing last summer, they said, we have not documented a single direct kratom-caused overdose death. That doesn't mean it's never happened, it never will. That means that it's, in terms of death risk, it's probably closer to caffeine than it is to morphine. Everything carries some risk, but some things, natural products, carry some built-in safeguards. You take too much, you feel pretty sick.
In terms of specific drug-drug interactions, it's not really been demonstrated in the scientific literature. It's almost undoubted that there are some drugs that you probably wouldn't want to take with kratom, but there's just not enough research on how it interacts with the body and the metabolic enzymes to come to conclusions about that yet. So most drugs are broken down by your liver, and if that drug that you're taking inhibits some of those processes, then it can increase or decrease the concentrations of other drugs that you may be taking and lead to bad side effects. But we just don't know that for kratom right now.
All right, we appreciate your questions. This concludes today's briefing. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I want to mention that several of the statements you heard today are on the website kratomcoalition.org. You can find several statements, including Dr. Holcomb's and Dr. Chisholm's, on that website, along with other resources that can be useful. Please sign in if you haven't already outside. We have a sign-in sheet outside. We'd love to be in touch with you after the briefing so we can meet with you one-on-one and answer your questions. So thank you again for coming today, and we really appreciate your attendance. And thank you to our panelists.